This episode was recorded September 4th, 2025. In this week's episode of We the Palmetto, we are taking a break from our usual format of interviewing politicians and candidates and introducing a new recurring segment we're calling The Issue, where we take a look at some of the biggest problems facing South Carolina and the challenges that they represent to our elected leaders who have an obligation to address them. And this first episode is going to be a doozy. I'm bringing in my best source for legal matters, attorney Ali Menegakis, and we are talking all about the issues facing South Carolina's legal system. We talked to Lowcountry voters. Trump was in true campaign form. Voting is officially underway. Joe Biden spoke here in the heart of downtown.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, Ali, thanks for joining me.
So great to be here, Nick.
You know, you and I have actually collaborated a bunch of times over the last handful of years. I don't know, maybe a dozen stories on different topics or so. Yeah. Do you actually know the first time you and I did a story together?
I don't remember. I wish I could say that I did.
I looked it up because I was like, how long ago was that? Our first story that I interviewed you for was like June 5th, 2020 or something. At the time, I think you were doing some pro bono work for bail and such. This is right after the Charleston riots.
Yes.
That's crazy
times. It was after the murder of George Floyd, and then there were all those protests, and all these protesters were arrested, and I was working on representing them in bond hearings, which, you know, we're going to be talking all about the need for reform here and why I had to go out and do that day because we didn't have attorneys for those young people.
It's kind of crazy because actually I found you because I was at one of those bond hearings, and I think you had approached one of the other stations and was like handing out your card or something. And I had like made mention of it, or I made note of it. I was like, I'm going to call her later to get a story. And we did. We ended up with a story. And I think that was about bond reform at the time. It's good stuff, though.
Yeah, it was like one of the first things we really did as South Carolina for criminal justice reform in terms of like getting involved in representing individuals that didn't have an attorney during that time. That was crazy, crazy times.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why you're here, though, is because you have been pushing for reform on various things, whether it's bond or speedy trial stuff. We've even talked about death penalty in the past. I mean, you've been kind of on a mission to help South Carolina reform its justice system into something that maybe provides justice a little more frequently, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. Equal protection, due process, those are things that are really, I think, in need of reform. And even if our organization and me as an individual, as an attorney representing people in criminal cases, can't get it done, at the very least, my goal and our mission at SC for CJR is to educate the people, because I really do, and we've talked about this a lot, I really do believe that if people knew what was happening in our criminal justice system, they would want it to change. And they would contact their legislatures and vote for people accordingly, because there's a lot of injustice that goes on. And frankly, which I want to talk about a little bit today, a lot of wasted money that we are spending on our criminal justice system, where we could be spending a lot of money elsewhere.
Okay, we're going to dive into all of that, but first, lay the groundwork for us, for folks who maybe don't have that 5 years of experience with you that I do. Give us a little bit about your background, the CV, where you are now, where you come from, all of that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not from South Carolina originally. I was born and raised in Florida. I went to law school in Florida, and I started my legal career as a public defender in South Florida in West Palm Beach Public Defender's Office. About almost 7 years ago now, I moved to Charleston, South Carolina. I joined the Public Defender's Office here in Charleston. I was working through the MacArthur Foundation grant that helped train public defenders to represent people in their bond hearings, which is where we first met each other. And then I went into private practice. I started South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform, which advocates for reducing mass incarceration and equality for individuals that are accused of crimes in the state of South Carolina. And now, not only am I still doing criminal defense, I work at Clekus Law Firm. That's my family law firm. My cousin is Nicholas Clekus, and we've been wanting to work together for a long time. So not only do I do criminal defense still, but I also do personal injury, and I'm also doing civil rights litigation too right now when it comes to people getting hurt at the hands of government officials.
Wow. It strikes me recently that, the legal system has come as a talking point in many circumstances in the political realm, right? We're seeing this sort of idea of like lawfare, right? We're seeing the justice system being strained each way, depending on who's in power. I'm just curious, over the last 10 years, have you seen or do you have any concerns about the way politicians are using this branch of government, these levers of justice, to potentially political means?
Yes. In short, yes. It's interesting, Nick, because when you and I first met, I would say like that year, 2019, I'd say like 2018, 2019, the beginning of 2020, we were on such a positive, we had such positive momentum towards criminal justice reform. And versus you think about like 10 years ago, I was an attorney, I was a new attorney, a public defender. Frankly, I hadn't even heard the phrase criminal justice reform just 10 years ago, okay? Then about 5 years later, there was this huge momentum. Obama was doing clemency work. Even Donald Trump was doing stuff with reform. And I really do think that there was a switch of 180 degrees after the murder of Judge George Floyd and the aftermath and the international outcry at that point. And what we saw was people really diving into why is law enforcement so powerful? Why are they disproportionately hurting people of color and low-income communities? And many people were pushing for reform to law enforcement agencies. And then in response to that, you saw the opposite, right? Which was, oh, no. We don't want to, quote, defund the police or take any funding away from the police. We need to support our police, and we need to be pushing towards a tough on crime approach. And ever since then, what I've seen is really the opposite. And now politicians, instead of what they were before, pushing towards reform and clemency and reducing mass incarceration, now are pushing to what we saw in the 80s and 90s, which is tough on crime, because being tough on crime sells. Not only does it sell, but it gets votes. And it's an easy, sure way to get elected. And it's unfortunate that we're going back there again. I see it. I've seen it in national politics. I'm seeing it in state politics. And I frankly see it even on the local, very local micro level here in Charleston.
Well, let's talk more about South Carolina specifically, because those are big issues. And yes, each state, each governor, each state house is going to have to deal with some version of those issues. But here in South Carolina, we have a plethora of our own problems that our lawmakers, our government officials could be doing something about right now. I want to start with how long it takes to get people through the court system. I mean, we're talking about, I think we're running a story, we ran a story last week about somebody who waited 5 years to get their name cleared, to get their day in court. I mean, we're seeing 3, 4, 5 years just to go to trial. That's victims waiting for justice. That's defendants waiting to prove themselves innocent. I mean, what's at the root of this issue? Why do we have such a backlog and it takes so long to get to trial?
Nick, you and I, we have talked about this topic before, probably about 4 years ago now. Nothing has changed, okay, since we talked about it 4 years ago.
But they said something has changed. The Supreme Court created new mechanisms for getting through trial dockets quicker. They made a whole show of it about a year ago, but nothing's changed.
Correct. So, in fact, I think it's worse now. Without getting into the whole Langford case that we talked about, I think a few years ago, the problem that we have, and I think the biggest thing to point out is there is no backlog, Nick. And we talked about this before. It's a backlog is when you are behind because the system's, delayed for some reason and it's supposed to work better. The system in South Carolina is working the exact way it's supposed to because we do not have certain rules in place to ensure that cases go faster to trial. We do not invest enough in the judiciary branch to have enough judges and court time and prosecutors and public defenders to make sure that there's enough court so that people are going to trial more often. The biggest thing that we talked about before and is still the case to this day is we do not have a speedy trial rule in this state. So when we talk about you have a right to a speedy trial under the federal Constitution, right? The Constitution doesn't say how long that's supposed to be. I ask people this all the time. Hey, how long do you think it should take you to go to trial and have a speedy trial? Some people say like, oh, I think a month. I think 6 months. Some will say, I think a few weeks. You never hear someone say 5 years.
Right.
And that's the reality of what's happening here in Charleston County, which, by the way, is one of the more well-funded counties in the state of South Carolina. And the wait time today is the same as it was 4 years ago, frankly, before COVID. So the whole COVID excuse is BS, in my opinion.
Sure.
Is still about 4 to 5 years.
I recently actually just saw something that I believe showed there were something like, I forgot the number, like more than 150,000 cases that they described as, backlogged, basically pending. But to me, it sounds like, and tell me if I'm wrong here, it sounds like you're saying there's no backlog because there isn't like a docket, like these cases aren't scheduled to go forward. They're there, but they're not on a schedule to be heard.
Yeah. Exactly. It's almost like, I'm trying to think of like a good analogy. It's like saying like, oh, I have a company and our goal is to go through 100, boxes of product per day. And then, one day we only go through, I don't know, like 50. And so we're a backlog of 50. We have no quota. We have no rules saying how many days or how many months it should take for a case to go to trial. We don't have that. So there is no backlog. Right. It's just a really poor run system
until we can get to it. And who knows when that'll be.
Yeah, and I would say not even until we get to it. It would be like until
we want to get to it.
Until we want to get to it. That is the key. And that's the really important thing that happened in that Langford case that we talked about.
So what can be done? What needs to be done? Is it simply we need more judges and we need more court space, we need more docket time effectively to get these cases through?
I honestly don't even think that just having more judges and more docket and more court time would fix the problem, because I think that we need to have some kind of rules in place and consequences if things don't go to trial the way they're supposed to. And that's where we're talking about a speedy trial right, a speedy trial rule.
Right.
So if you don't go to trial within 4 years, you're not violating, for the most part, any kind of right to a speedy trial because there's no rule that says that it has to be done within a certain amount of time.
Right.
Whereas you look at other states, for example, when I used to practice in Florida, if you were arrested for a misdemeanor, let's say like a DUI or assault and battery, possession of marijuana, and you wanted to go to trial, a jury trial, you would have to be brought to trial within 90 days. That's 3 months from the date that you were arrested. For a felony, even a first-degree murder, okay, you would have to be brought to trial within 6 months. Now, people say, well, how are you going to get ready for a murder within 6 months? You have the right to waive that right, and then you can go back and you can demand it again and be heard within 50 days. What's my point? It's not about the numbers here. The point is that there's consequences if you don't meet that deadline.
There needs to be a rule,
right,
so that it can be held accountable.
It would force them to work harder and more efficiently and to really provide better offers, better discovery, and to reduce the amount of time it takes for people to go to trial, reduce the jail population, frankly, instead of people languishing in jail for 4 to 5 years to go to trial for something where the sentence might be even less than their pending trial date.
Yeah, that's a wild thought there. I'm just, in terms of this situation in particular, do you think that South Carolina is unusual, or is this the state of play everywhere?
I think it's absolutely unusual. I think one of the biggest things that makes us stand out is the way specifically our trial docket works. Before this case, it's called Langford v. State, okay? South Carolina, years ago, not that long ago, within the last 10 years, was the only state in the entire country to have the prosecution control which cases went to trial and when. Every other state, the judiciary branch handled that. The South Carolina Supreme Court held in that case that it's unconstitutional to have a prosecutor decide which cases go to trial and when. So then the Supreme Court said, okay, prosecutors, you're not allowed to control the trial docket anymore. Judiciary, you guys are supposed to control when cases go to trial. Now, the crazy thing about this was that a lot of the courts in South Carolina didn't do anything. They didn't listen to the Supreme Court. Charleston did. It was one of the few that did. And so they created this new court system where they heard cases chronologically from oldest to newest, which is the best way to do it when you don't have a speedy trial, right? Then a year ago, the Supreme Court all of a sudden issued this order saying, you know what? We're going to go back to the way we were doing it kind of before Langford, and we're going to have the prosecutors kind of decide which cases go to trial again. We are the only state in the entire country that has prosecutors, Nick, that decide when cases go to trial, even though it was found unconstitutional by our own Supreme Court. It's absurd. It's not absurd. It's unconstitutional. In my opinion, I do not think we should be doing that. And I think the only reason that we're doing it is because our legislature has not created any kind of law when it comes to speedy trial. That is the solution, not having prosecutors control the docket again.
So I think personally that the speedy trial issue is probably, for me, the top issue in the criminal justice system here in South Carolina. But there are plenty others that in particular candidates are talking about right now. One of them is the selection of judges, right? Right now, the judges are technically elected by the state legislature, okay? We're one of 2 states that do it like that. A good handful of states, the judges are appointed by the governor. Some of them have approval votes as well. But we're one of 2 states that selects our judges from the state legislature. And there's a lot of questions right now from a lot of our political candidates that are coming in here, especially for governor, who are saying the governor needs to be more involved, the legislature needs to be less involved. And part of that is because we have so many lawyer legislators who pick the judges and then are in those judges' courtrooms. I just want, from your opinion, do you see a problem with lawmakers who are also lawyers picking the judges that will ultimately rule in a case that they may be representing?
Well, I kind of see 2 different issues here.
Right.
I see the issue of, well, what is the fairest way to get the best kind of attorney to become a judge, right? How are we going to have the most unbiased process for electing judges or appointing judges to the bench? And then the second issue is whoever is appointing them or voting on them or electing them, should they be allowed to represent clients in front of that judge in court? So we'll look at the second one first. I think that our judicial process has a safeguard for that. And there is, judges take an oath of office, or an oath every time that they are placed on the bench and they become a member of the judiciary, and lawyers take an oath. And that oath is that we cannot have any kind of conflict of interest in a case. And so the judges, like let's say that there was a legislator that was very pivotal in pushing for a certain judge, I guess, to make it to the bench. In that case, that judge would have a requirement to recuse themselves from any case. If a judge doesn't do that, other members of the bar or the public can make a motion or can write letters to the Supreme Court and the Judiciary Committee to say, hey, there's a conflict of interest here. Why is that attorney allowed to be present in front of them? So I'm not as concerned about that. I'm more concerned about having one person decide who is going to be a judge, right? Specifically, one person being, part of a certain political party.
Sure.
And like we talked about before, politics these days, especially when it comes to the different branches of government, have been more
There's
extreme.
less collaboration.
Yeah, and
maybe
more extreme, especially
Sure.
the attack on the judiciary, right? The judicial branch. Misinformation out there about what the judicial branch is doing. So I would be more concerned about one single person having that,
So you're okay with the legislature picking judges as long as the judges and the lawyers are respecting their oath to their offices.
Well, I think that lawyers and judges should always respect their oaths when it comes to conflicts of interest. But it's not to say that, a committee of legislators picking judges is a perfect system either.
Right.
I think I can definitely see flaws in that system as well, for the same reason why a governor being the sole person
Sure.
picking a judge would be as well. However, what is the other alternative? Some states, for example, Florida, where I was, so they had the governor that could appoint judges, and then they also had judicial elections where anyone could run, and it was on the ballot every year.
Yeah,
So-
like solicitors, they're on the
Yeah,
ballot.
exactly.
Probate judges, I believe, are
Correct.
elected as well.
Yeah, probate judges are the only judge that are elected. And, sure, there's problems with, when it comes to judges running for office. You're talking about money. You're talking just like any kind of election. Who has enough money to run? Does that mean that they're the best candidate just because they have all this funding, et cetera? However, personally, I kind of like that system better. At least we're not dealing with potential bias or potential
There's some backdoor
issues.
deals.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
When we talked earlier, you had mentioned that there's an issue with even things like translation services. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing? And this seems like an issue that could be fairly easily fixed in terms of maybe you just need some more money, some more positions. I don't know. Walk me through it.
Well, money,
Money.
right?
It's always money.
We not only need more funding for the translators, we need more funding for more judges, for more court time, for more prosecutors, for more public defenders, and in turn, more interpreters that are present for court. So the question you're talking about, the topic you're talking about, is that we have an extreme shortage of interpreters in our state when it comes to all languages, including the most relevant one, which is Spanish.
Right.
And people have been languishing in jail waiting for their trial, not even when their case is actually brought up to court, despite not having a speeding trial rule. Then it's delayed again because there's not enough Spanish interpreters. That's one small example of why we need to be focused on providing funding for the judiciary, right, and for the processing of cases, as opposed to what? As opposed to focusing the majority of our funding on tough on crime aspects, like arresting more people, or if you want to go there, if we're going to be increasing funding and pushing more for tough on crime, then equally as much, we need to be investing in the court system. Because if you just invest on arresting people and police and incarcerating people, then you're never going to be able to resolve all of these cases in the court system.
One of the big issues that we're seeing governor candidates talk a lot about or attorney general candidates in general, is this sort of resurgence of the desire to use the death penalty.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about like the death penalty, I kind of break it down into really three parts, right? We've got the fiscal issue, which is the funding involved with it. We've got the moral issue, which is that the right thing to do, and also has to do with, cruel and unusual punishment, which we talked about the firing squad before. And then the third issue is whether it's smart being a final decision. And when I talk about that, I'm talking more about people that have been wrongfully convicted.
Sure.
And you think about the last 20 years, we have the Innocence Project,
Right.
right? And they have found hundreds upon hundreds of people that have been wrongfully convicted and then sentenced to death row. If you believe in the death penalty, despite like some of these, candidates or people that are for the death penalty, well, nothing's perfect, but that doesn't mean that bad people shouldn't be punished for what they did, whatever. Regardless of that, you can't run away from the numbers. And I actually printed these out and I looked it up for today because I was thinking you were probably going to ask about this. But so when we're talking about the annual cost per inmate, and by the way, this is from the South Carolina Department of Corrections information data here.
Sure.
In 2021 to 2022 fiscal year, it cost annually per inmate in prison, okay, $32,247 to house them. That's just an inmate in the Department of Corrections. When you're talking about a death row inmate, this is not about legal costs, Nick. This is just housing them because there's solitary confinement. There's a lot of other requirements they have for that. $400,000 per year. Per person, per inmate, okay?
And that's not legal costs.
That's not even including the legal costs.
That's punishment costs.
Yes. When you're adding the legal costs and all the other costs to it, you're looking at $1.1 million more than the life without parole inmate per person.
We have people running for office now that are promising changes. And of course, we always hear politicians talk about wanting to fix some issues and bring change and all that good stuff. What are you looking for in the next governor or attorney general, specifically when we're talking about fixing the criminal justice system in South Carolina? What do they need to bring to the table? What should be the first thing that they try and tackle?
I would love to see someone run on a platform for attorney general that is going to start looking at the rights of not only victims, but defendants. The attorney general, they have an oath to follow the Constitution and enforce the laws of the state. Some of those laws include the defendant's rights. But how often do we see them running on that, right? It's harder to win on that. It's easier to win on a tough on crime kind of death penalty platform. So I would love to see them say, you know what, we have a really big problem with our docket system here. We have a really big problem in our local municipal courts. We have cops that are prosecuting cases that aren't lawyers. We have magistrates that have never been to law school. We have people that are waiting 4 to 5 years in jail for their right to a trial. And we need to create a special task force to investigate all the injustices that are happening in our court system because we are terribly behind the times. That is what I would love to see. And I would be, shocked if I saw it in this environment we're in right now.
All right. Allie, thanks for coming in. Thanks for breaking this down for us. I'm sure we could talk another 2 hours on all of the issues. I mean, we didn't even talk about like mental health in jails and how all those issues are being handled. But thanks for lending your expertise and coming in.
I love being here. Thanks so much, Nick, for talking about this topic.